Have you put in the hard work to improve your diet, nutrition, and lifestyle, but you might not be seeing the results in your health that you're expecting to see? Do you feel like something may be missing from your treatment protocol or wellness journey, but you're not being able to figure out what? Well, today, Nawar and I discuss the impact our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and even our sense of community has on inflammation, immune function, our healing, and overall health in this compelling conversation about the mind body connection. Nawar Kamona is a functional nutritionist and bioregulatory practitioner and researcher. She studied personalized nutrition and bioregulatory medicine, gaining deep expertise in understanding the body as an interconnected system. Her academic journey includes a master's in personalized nutrition, where she explored the science of tailoring health strategies to an individual's unique biology, environment, and lifestyle. She also trained extensively in bioregulatory medicine, focusing on how stress, trauma, and lifestyle influence the body on a molecular level, including its immune response, inflammation, and overall balance. Outside her clinical work, Nawar is a creative and compassionate spirit. She paints, hosts workshops, coaches women's circles, and volunteers with children, all while seeking a deeper understanding of herself and the world. Nawar is committed to empowering others with knowledge, self compassion, and lasting tools for well being. Hi, Nawar. Thank you so much for being with me today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Alia. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm so excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, the mind body connection. And I just want to start off by asking you, what is your experience with this field?
I love that you mentioned that, Alia, because as you know, in today's world, a lot is highlighted with longevity, and it's an umbrella term for nutrition, supplements, biohacking, sports, medicine, and all those amazing things that play a very big role when it comes to your health. But a huge factor that I noticed that was missing was community, number one, as well as how our thoughts and emotions directly impact our physical health. So, one of the biggest ingredients to health that's not taken on a very important part as supplements, exercise, etc., is that mind body connection and how specific scenarios can actually really influence our health outcomes, regardless of great diet, biomarkers that have gone back to normal, physical activity that's up to par, etc.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think science is catching up a bit because I talk a lot about this on my socials and with my clients. The very famous Harvard University study on longevity and how to live a long, healthy life. I'll link this below. It's the TED Talk by Robert Waldinger. And it's basically, they did this huge study. It's the biggest study, and I think the longest study on people living well. And they found out that, whether you have money or not, whether you eat well or not, whether you manage your stress or not, the number one predictor of a good, long, healthy life is our relationships, is our sense of community. And there's also something called the Rosetto effect, which is also this effect that community plays on our risk of cardiovascular disease. And it was a study also that took place in Pennsylvania with a small, originally Italian community where they had the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease and fatalities from cardiovascular disease. This is something I studied in nutrition school. And this was due to the fact that this originally Italian community lived intergenerationally. Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa all lived together. And that actually impacted their heart health in a very positive way. So there's a lot of like science that's now starting to catch up with this concept of mind body connection, or how we experience our world, how we feel in our world, and how we feel with the people around us, and how important that is to our wellness, as well as nutrition and exercise and stress management, supplements, and all those things. What's your experience of it professionally or personally? Can you share a little bit more?
An important study, and I would love for that to be more spoken about, especially with, as practitioners educate clients, and for that to be more on social media rather than all of those extreme things that we need to do. I actually once read a meta-analysis that found strong connections. So going back to what you were saying, strong connections had at least 50% higher chance of survival. So those people with strong connections of surviving regardless of their age, their gender, their health status, ethnicity. Obviously, we know that certain people in different areas do have risks to certain diseases based on their genetics, etc. So going back to that community, is having that supportive community impacts health so much. It can impact it more than quitting smoking can, more than being physically active, more than it's the missing ingredient to so many health plans, honestly. And it's one of the most frustrating things. Not to say that people don't take this into consideration. A lot of amazing practitioners do take this into consideration. I'm a part of like a community of great practitioners who do consider community, who do consider the negative consequence of social isolation. Obviously, as we know, social isolation was very much highlighted during the pandemic, and a lot of scientists were starting to basically look at the correlation to what social isolation can do to certain health diseases, outcomes, etc. But also going back to that, there was another famous study. I'm just getting really passionate about this topic of ladies with breast cancer and women who actually joined a support group felt better and had a higher chance of living longer than those who didn't actively participate in support groups. So that's a really big proof that not only emotional connection, of course, the right type of emotional connection, but having shared experiences and relatability has a huge, profound effect on physical health. We know that Netflix has a great series on blue zones, you know, in Japan, Sardinia, Italy, the secrets to longevity. People are starting to talk about community, blah, blah, blah. But it goes deeper into that layer of being connected to friends and family, having that relatability, leaning on each other, other than, blah, 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 as we said, gym, etc., nutrition. Disclaimer, I think those things are great. But if you're doing them and nothing is changing or shifting in your health outcomes that you have been wanting to work on, then there is a huge missing ingredient. And that's community and goes back to a lot of things that you and I were discussing about the mind body connection earlier.
I mean, ultimately, we're social beings, right? This is just proving that. And sometimes we forget about that. We think that health is like, is has to be more tangible. It's like the numbers that we see on our blood results, the supplements or the deficiencies or the kind of time we spent at the gym or how much we're pressing or building or calories or all these numbers, all these metrics, which again are very important, even the number on a scale, how much we weigh. But we forget the intangible, like how well we feel in our day-to-day life, how connected we are. And we are ultimately social beings. I mean, there are parts of the brain and there are neural networks that are literally there just to connect with other human beings or to mirror other human beings. So it's part of our design. It's part of our biological and biochemical design. You spoke about like isolation, and I think there are studies out there, and it's very easy to Google for anyone listening, where you just type in that loneliness is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's how negatively impactful it is on our heart health and our respiratory health, apparently, just because being lonely is so stressful. It's so stressful. And that amount of stress on the body is like impacting our heart health. And also, when you talked about healing, I wanted to ask you because I think I've come across some reading about how these positive emotions that we get from spending time with our loved ones and being connected can upregulate genes. So, would you say that, yes, we are more susceptible to certain genetic conditions? Like if, you come from a family with heart problems or diabetes, you are more susceptible, you are more sensitive. But would you argue that when you live in community and you have these good connections, that epigenetics comes into play where it might actually interfere with your gene expression?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting subject that I definitely am learning more about every single time I read about it. And we did study this in my master's. Actually, there have been a lot of studies with twins. Twins have identical genes, and one lives off a certain lifestyle, the other lives off another lifestyle, completely different countries, time zones, climates, environments, and their health outcomes differ. So that goes back to epigenetics, having this gene, does it switch on or off based on your environment? And your thoughts can influence how your body responds to certain things. So certain thoughts can cause high stress response. A chronic stress response will influence cortisol production, blood sugar, etc., etc. And those things can have a negative impact on health. So chronic stress can cause and exacerbate conditions that you may be predisposed to. It's just a way of, pulling the trigger, basically. It's there, and now I'm pulling the trigger. And there are a lot of things. And going back to the whole community that you and I were just discussing. So, for the listener that says, actually, I have a community, I'm very close to my family, I have great social bonds, I have, people around me who are very compassionate, non judgmental. I do exercise, I do work out. My blood tests are finally better, but I don't feel good. I don't feel good. What's happening? We know that even, for example, this goes back to the deeper layer is the way you think, what you think, how you are taking in this community of yours. Maybe you have a great community, but do you feel socially rejected by this community? What are your thoughts when you go home at night? How do you feel about yourself? And there are such interesting studies of how social rejection and negative thoughts can lead to inflammation. So, by experiencing rejection, there are areas in the brain that are linked to physical pain. So it's not just in your head. And this physical pain can have repercussions on the immune system. It can increase markers like CRP, which is a C reactive protein. And that is a non-specific inflammatory marker that we do see in blood tests. So it does signify that there is inflammation. We can't really say where this inflammation is. History taking is very important here, etc. I mean, it can go on and on, but having your inflammatory markers raised from just something as specific as that in that study is really interesting.
I love how you connect our thoughts to our overall health. It's something I also speak a lot about with my clients because it is so important. And I've learned that every single cell in your body has a receptor for your thoughts. And I say this all the time, like our bodies are listening to us. And we can actually feel this when you close your eyes and think of something that made you really angry. You can feel your body change physiologically, your heartbeat start to race, you get a bit tense in the whole system, even your digestive system, and there's nothing happening in front of you. You're just in your room, and you're just having a negative experience or a negative angry thinking pattern, right? Versus if you remember your loved ones and a beautiful memory, the whole body responds to that as well. All your cells, all your systems, the nervous system especially, can hear you, can hear your thoughts. And as you said, your thoughts can trigger cortisol response, can trigger blood sugar, because if it's triggering a cortisol response, sometimes your body will also liberate sugar from the liver to give you energy to deal with the fight or flight, right? So that's why it can also trigger a blood sugar response and inflammation over time. So I love that you bring the subject up because I think it is such a necessary component to being healthy and well.
I love that, Alia. You're doing amazing work. Is that also how you work with clients?
Absolutely. Because, of course, I talk about diet and exercise and stress management, but I absolutely, part of stress management is managing the mind. And sometimes people think when they hear about stress, they think about deadlines at work or stress with work. But no, stress can be rumination, overthinking, not liking yourself, the negativity bias, just like always thinking negatively, which again is something we're built with, the negativity bias, which is valuing negative experiences more than positive just to be prepared for potential threats. But over time, if this is on overdrive, it can create inflammation and create a cortisol response because we're stressed all the time. So stress isn't just deadlines at work or having an annoying boss and having 50 emails to answer, although those things are very valid stress. It can also just be the way that we think, the way we've been conditioned to think, or as you said, social rejection, or not feeling like you can truly be yourself in your community. So you have all these lovely people around you who love you, but do they truly know you? Or do you feel really connected? Or do you really have a best friend that you can call on in times of need and cry on their shoulder or talk to them about a tough experience? Men sometimes have a difficult time with this. So all these things are so important to being healthy and well. And I say to my clients, look, you can eat all the brown rice and chicken and kale that you want, but if you don't take care of what's going on in your mind and in your heart, there's no kale that helps you kind of heal if your internal environment is also not being dealt with.
That's very true. That yeah, it's how your thoughts and emotions directly impact physical health. And there's a field of study called psychoneuroimmunology that highly investigates how this happens.
I love this field. I know it's the study of mind body connection.
Yeah.
Please do elaborate.
Well, there are a lot of interesting studies that have been made with the PNI, the short abbreviation for psychoneuroimmunology. And this is basically a field of neuroscience, immunology, the study of the immune system, of the brain, psychology, and sometimes endocrinology, the hormones, the endocrine system, adrenal glands, thyroid, etc. So going back to the cortisol that you were mentioning, two scientists, do not quote me on this. I think they are American, at least one of them is. They did a study on rats. So similar to the dog study on Pavlov's dog learning to salivate with the sound of the bell. So it's basically training your brain to associate one thing to another. But these scientists were studying rats and they gave the rats sweetened water, and they paired the sweetened water with a drug that suppressed immune function. Over time, the rats learned to associate the sweet water with the effects of the drug. Once the drug was no longer given and it was just the sweet water, the immune system still became suppressed. And that is extremely groundbreaking because your brain can literally learn how to control certain things, which is the immune system. So, this is proof that your immune system does not work in isolation, and it can work with other regions in the body, such as the brain. And that study shows that it's deeply connected to psychological processes. So, the immune system was connected to psychological processes. Once the drug was no longer given and it was just the sweetened water, these rats had that association. Oh, okay, I've received the sweetened water. I'm going to suppress my immune system.
The
So,
expectation took their body there.
exactly. And I think that was one of the studies that actually birthed psychoneuroimmunology, and how the thoughts and the emotions and the brain activity can influence the immune response. And this kind of ties into the whole, you have this community, you have all these amazing things that are happening for you that you're working for. You're being disciplined about changing your habits, you're including great food, you're complying with certain drugs, medications from your doctor, supplements from your nutritionist. Yet things are still not shifting, although your blood markers are improving. The way I like to think of it is this is psychoneuroimmunology, and then there's another link of the nocebo effect and the placebo effect. And tapping into everything that you just mentioned on, your mindset, your beliefs, these things can influence your healing process. So removing certain foods and toxins are so crucial to long-term health. We know studies about pollution and the heavy metals present in pollution and how that can influence cardiovascular outcomes and exacerbate already existing cardiovascular disease, dementia, Parkinson's. There is so much research, definitely not undermining this, but the placebo effect is such a fascinating phenomena that is so well known in medicine. And we use that in trials. So we have the placebo, we have the drug. We use this in trials. So there is so much evidence to say your brain can influence outcomes. It's scary and beautiful. What you think can influence outcomes. And believing something will actually trigger measurable change. And for example, let's say I actually see this a lot, and I was this type of patient. Studying nutrition, we started feeling scared of certain foods. And I think this is a very common thing when you start studying nutrition, or when you're a patient that starts adopting all of these things and you're overwhelmed, you start viewing food as quite scary. I've noticed this as a common thread amongst people who are trying to heal certain ailments, such as inflammatory bowel disease. So we have ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, from something as simple, or not simple, but pathophysiologically simpler, as IBS, which is very much linked to the mind in the present moment. So let's say you cut out gluten or sugar or dairy or whatever it is. And at that time, you think it's going to heal you. Your body will respond, and you will start to have that belief that, cutting out gluten and dairy, I'm doing something very good for myself. Disclaimer, this is not a one size fits all. And we know in functional medicine, we do cut things out. It's because there's something underlining, and we should be able to introduce them later on. So disclaimer to anyone listening to this with a chronic condition that they're healing from. Obviously, nothing is magic, but it's the power of the mind body. So, cutting things out and knowing that they're going to be good for you will create positive outcomes. 99% of the time, they should be creating positive outcomes. The flip side, let's say you get better. You get better, things are good, you're flowing, you're great. You're no longer seeing your nutritionist, you are going back into society, but you know you're not eating your dairy, you are not eating your sugar, you are not eating your gluten. The flip side is the nocebo effect. This happens when you now the perspective has shifted. I cut it out because I know it's good for me. Now I can't touch it because it's bad for me.
So the placebo is the belief that something can have a positive impact on your health. It's the belief that something can heal you. And the nocebo effect is the belief of negative consequences. So something can harm you. So Nawar is now explaining that, when we carry this belief that maybe gluten is not good for us, the body responds the same way in as intense of a response as like the placebo. I think it's 70% successful, the placebo, from what I read. So the nocebo is as successful in the sense that if you believe something's not good for you, it'll start to present itself in that
It,
way. So
yeah,
yeah, sorry to just cut you off, but I wanted
no,
to make sure that people know what that meant. So go ahead.
thank you. I tend to get quite passionate, so
I
I'm
love
very
it.
happy.
I'm
I'm
me
very
too.
happy.
I love it.
I'm very happy that you did give that explanation. So, as you're saying, it definitely happens when negative beliefs or fears about a treatment or food can exacerbate symptoms or make symptoms worse with no physical reason for that. So, you're convinced that gluten is bad for you. You do eat a piece of bread, you will bloat. Even if your digestive capacity is able to actually break down the gluten. Your digestive efficiency has been worked on really well. So it's not the gluten. It can be in some cases, but later on, it might not be the gluten, but it's the expectation of the harm of the gluten. So I think that mindset is really important if you're removing certain foods or substances that you know that will help, but focusing too much on what's bad can backfire.
100%. This is something, it's funny, I share with my clients as well. Like, I'm kind of more from the practice of living the 80-20 life. 80% of the time, we're super clean and eating well and home cooked as much as possible. But 20%, you're going to go to a wedding, you're going to have a birthday, and you want to have the cake, right? Again, depending person to person, how inflamed we are, or what's going on with our blood sugar, or if there's a lot of weight that needs to be lost. It just depends on the person. But generally, I try not to be black and white, even with lifestyle. But when my clients have cleaned things up and they're like, Alia, I ate the sandwich, gluten, for example, or I had a cupcake. And I said, listen, we don't want to live our life eating cupcakes. Obviously, I'm a health coach. I care that you're not eating junk food. However, if you decide to eat the cupcake, do it with joy and pleasure and with the belief that your body is intelligent and can digest it. Because if you're going to eat it anyway, eat it with that belief rather than the nocebo belief, which is this cupcake is going to bloat me and trigger a huge blood sugar spike, et cetera, and put on weight and all these things. I said, no matter what you're eating, no matter where you are in life, whatever you decide to eat, do so with a good mindset. Again, obviously, we want to eat as healthy as possible, but regardless, we should never sit down to a meal with the nocebo effect. I'll share also below a TED talk or a TEDx talk. Her name is my name, Dr. Alia Crum, I think it's her last name. And she shows this. It's like a 10 or 15-minute TED talk. She shows like a smoothie or two types of smoothies, one with a lot of sugar and like 1,000 calories, and another one that's very low. She gave the low sugar smoothie to a group of people and the high sugar smoothie to a group of people. And there are many different examples. This is just one that she shared. And she told them all that all of these smoothies are 1,000 calories and they all have, I don't know, like crazy amounts of sugar. And they all displayed a blood sugar spike, regardless of how much actual sugar was in the smoothie. I'm probably butchering this example, but the point is the studies are out there on animals and on humans. I'm going to link it below. Please spend time looking at this, but it's really a good TED talk depicting how our minds can absolutely influence how our bodies respond to not only our food, but to our life, to inflammation, to cortisol, to stress.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to see that TED Talk. So a thing that I do in practice is that black and white thinking can really, it scares me to potentially box someone like that. And it can really scare the client. And, oh no, this is bad, this is good. Like labeling foods in a certain way is, as you know, I know that you work with body image conditions, etc. So what I like to focus on what can we add into the diet. So, what's nourishing and healing, other than the healing foods, but the positive habits, the community, believing that your body can heal is one of the top things that we really focus on in practice and that have had the most beautiful outcomes, actually. So, it's not just about what you eat or don't eat, but what you think when you're eating. And, functional medicine does highlight you are what you eat, but you are what you eat when you're thinking about what you're consuming as well. So it's trusting and having that shift of mindset from intense perfectionism and negativity or optimism to just balance and embracing that approach.
I mean, ultimately, we've got something called the gut brain axis, right? Which is where the gut and the brain are in constant communication with each other via something called the vagus nerve, which is this nerve that has bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. The gut is actually comprising of, it's called the enteric nervous system because it has its own nervous system and it comprises of like 500 to 600 million neurons. It's so intelligent, it can almost operate autonomously from the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. This is just to give an idea or an image as to like how beautifully designed and intricate the system is. But anyway, there is communication between brain and gut and brain. And so when I talk as a health coach, I talk about managing inflammation in the gut and eating well so that the brain and our mindset and our mental health is clear and well and we have optimal cognitive function and we feel happy and well. But the opposite is true as well. If the brain or the mind is constantly in the negative loop of thinking or negative beliefs or is constantly stressed and we're in this like negative pattern, it can also impact the gut. And so this enteric nervous system that consists of millions of neurons will receive this information and can actually tighten up your digestive system. And what do I mean by tighten up? You know, when you're really stressed and you're sitting down to a meal and the gut, you just either don't have an appetite or it just feels really tight. So, what's happening is we're lowering our digestive system's function, we're suppressing its function. So we're actually stressing the body or the digestive system eating at that time. We're not absorbing nutrients as optimally as we should. We're probably not even managing waste the way we need to. Sometimes we learned in nutrition school that if we sometimes get clients who are dealing with constipation, yes, of course, we need to increase hydration or fiber in the diet and maybe look at some probiotics or supplements, etc. But sometimes constipation is literally the holding back of thoughts and emotions. It's tightness in the emotional body. You know, it's that holding back, it's that clenching of the jaw. And so the whole body is tight and holding back that you're literally holding back waste. So this bidirectional communication between gut and the brain is so powerful. And again, the gut is important in managing this, but the brain and the mind is as important as well. They're partners.
That's very, very true. There are studies that show that. Obviously, we know the studies of the placebo, but there are studies of the nocebo effect as well. There's actually a nocebo interesting study that stood out to me. In 2007, a man was participating in a clinical trial for a new antidepressant. And after a fight with his girlfriend, he impulsively decided to take 29 capsules in the attempt to overdose. After he swallowed the 29 capsules, he felt that his heart was racing, his blood pressure dropping, and his body was completely shutting down. He was in and out of a conscious state. They panicked and rushed him to the ER. And, the doctors found him in a very critical state. His blood pressure was very dangerously low, as you can see from the monitor. And he was on the verge of collapse. But after hours of trying to stabilize him, so I'm not sure what they were doing, either trying to pump his stomach or I don't really remember the ins and out of the study. But they later found out that he had swallowed 29 sugar pills. So it was a clinical trial trialing a new drug. And to do that, you would give placebo sugar pills and you would give the actual drug. The participants, it's a double blinded study, they wouldn't know which medication they took just to see the effect of this drug, whether it's good enough to get on the market. And they recognized later on that he had just taken sugar pills. And what happened once the man knew that he had taken sugar pills, once he was reassured with that idea, everything stabilized. His blood pressure went back to normal. All his symptoms just kind of regulated, and he was sent back home. And that's just another, wrapping this subject up on how powerful our minds can be, and that there is a lot of evidence to that. So, what we think can have a positive or a challenging impact on us.
That is such a profound example of the nocebo effect, that he was so stressed about his life that his blood pressure, his cardiovascular markers, everything was impacted. I would love to ask you about your work in the Children's Hospital. I know you've got also some really interesting insights and experience working with sick children in a hospital. Could you share some of those stories with us?
Yeah, definitely. So this is just a side note for most people that don't know me. It's just a volunteering with kids on certain days of the week. So it's usually every Friday, and we play with children in wards. These children are very very sick. They can either have IVs strapped to them, tubes coming from different areas of their body, and it's from around a few weeks old up until 13 years. It's sad to say that children teach us things when they don't mean to teach us things. They're not meant to teach us things. They're meant to, live. They're meant to be happy, be healthy. But I learned something really interesting is that make believe is not just child's play, it's a therapeutic tool. And, this does touch up on the nocebo placebo effect. It ties into the more adult term visualization, affirmation. So when kids do engage in imaginative activities, they do feel happier. Some of the kids dress up, or we dress up for the kids. We pretend that we're superheroes. We pretend that we're the villain. They're trying to attack us, and they're strong and they're powerful. And they feel happier, they feel less stressed, and they're more resilient to pain. And combining this whole like play with a supportive environment really significantly enhances the whole healing journey. So we know that positive emotions like happiness, etc., does influence certain responses in the brain.
I know it strengthens the vagus nerve, so it's really good for vagal tone, which is
Hmm.
very important for overall health. And to come out of the stress response of fight or flight and into the parasympathetic response of rest, digest, heal, and restore.
Yeah, definitely. And engaging in pleasant activities does release endorphins, and endorphins are natural painkillers. So they do increase the pain tolerance. There are multi mechanisms at play. So we have the happiness increasing just the experience of what's going on. So that influences the resilience of the situation. Endorphins acting as painkillers, increasing the tolerance of pain, the distraction and the engagement in something enjoyable. So we have like we play video games, we play Uno. Actually, one of the kids taught me how to play Uno. I've never played Uno. So even a child feeling that they could teach you something really influences their morale, and it really reduces the perceived pain during medical procedures or the fear that they have right before the operation. So we sometimes see children right before they're entering the operation, they'll be in their gowns. So positive emotions can reduce the brain's pain processing centers. And it was really fascinating and almost sad for me, other than the other things that you see in the hospital. But this imaginative and creative play really influences reward pathways in the brain that distract and influence the experience that they're experiencing. So I really wonder how we can do that as adults, pretending to be a superhero. Would that make us feel more empowered and less vulnerable? Would that alter the perception of discomfort? And, going back to mentioning all these mechanisms at play, self compassion is such an interesting thing with children that this make believe reduces distress, pain processing, but also they have so much self compassion towards themselves. And as adults, we pour them with compassion and teach them to have self compassion. It's okay. It's okay. You're going to be fine. You're okay. Let's focus on Super Mario. Let's focus on this. Let's dress up as a Disney princess. The whole balloons in the hospital for their birthday, celebrating every single thing. And it's so interesting because children have fragile systems. Their immune system is still developing. So they're more prone to infection, especially when they're in the hospital. So it's very interesting to watch this from afar and see how well they do with the perception. And not to mention that there are a lot of children that suffer and are suffering and have been in hospital, let alone weeks, months, but years. Some kids have never even been home since the day that they were born. And make believe and all of those things may not get them home quicker. And it's definitely not to say that this is a quick fast track to treatment, but it definitely changes the whole experience. And that is the most important thing, because if their experience was horrible, their outcomes may not be as good as what we're seeing. Even if they've been in hospital for years, they're still, reacting well to the medicine, they're reacting well to healing, etc. So the experience one has with their healing process is so important to just focusing on the end game, because that experience is a telltale of the end game, meaning by the final treatment or the healing or the discharge to home. In child terms, the child play and the games, etc., are the stress management techniques that us adults do engage in today's world. The stress, the mindfulness, meditation, the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, physical activity, trauma informed therapies, the compassionate inquiry, etc.
I think that's such an interesting experience that you're having. And it's not a formal study, but it's anecdotal experience that you're seeing firsthand the difference between children who engage in kind of imaginatory and playful experiences, or they're more curious, or they're laughing more, just positive emotions in general. It contributes to their healing. And you're seeing that firsthand. There's so much to learn, as you said, when it comes to adults. It's just translated differently. As you said, it could be visualizations or positive affirmations, meditation. But I know how important play is for adults. There's actually a book. I forget who the author is. I'll link it below. But it's about play for adults, to be playful
Mhm.
in our life, to not take ourselves so seriously, to not take our lives so seriously, to inject humor into our daily life, into our relationships, to make fun of ourselves, and to just like laugh at ourselves once in a while, to be silly or just do things for just the pure joy of doing it, or for silliness, or to just, be light about things. It's so important, and it upregulates our gene expression, and it's good for our hormones, you know? And so it's implicated in so many different ways for health. You also said something about when kids are about to go into treatment or into a surgery or operation or something, that you help them focus on other things like the superhero. And, there's also a lot of, I guess, literature or a lot of discussions about how where your focus is where your energy goes, or where your focus goes, your energy flows, which is basically we are energetic beings. Emotions are energy in motion. Our thoughts, every single thought we have has an electronic signature in the brain. It's energy. Everything is energy. So if you're focusing on something, the energy of the whole system, of the whole body, can also be focused in that direction in different capacities, but in many ways. What else have you seen in clinical practice or in your professional experience that relates to adult health and wellness when it comes to the mind body connection?
What's interesting is that I'll get the client that has tried everything and nothing worked, or has great nutrition, super athletic, or they don't have to be super athletic, but they engage in a lot of physical activity, they take care, they meditate, etc. And still they suffer with irregular periods. I've seen clients with a lot of irregular periods, PCOS, unable to shift certain weight. So I don't usually work with clients who want to lose weight, depending on what's happening for them, but unable to shift weight sometimes, from rheumatoid arthritis to ulcerative colitis, a lot of eczema clients, so atopic diseases such as eczema, psoriasis. And incredible outcomes have occurred with these clients when we start to work more on the stress response. The body can't heal if it's in chronic stress. And stress definitely does play a great role. There is a place for it in the human body, but we know that short term stress can activate the immune system in a good way. Short term stress can be anti inflammatory, but chronic stress, which is everywhere, your boss can influence your chronic stress response. Your spouse, your friends, the environment. Stress does come in different forms. There are different types of stressors that the body will react to. But the stress that I'm speaking about right now is that deep internal dialogue. And going back to short term activation of these systems can enhance immune response, which is what we want. But the chronic activation of stress can suppress many systems in the body. And one of the things is reducing the lymphocyte production. Lymphocytes are white blood cells. They help the body's immune system fight cancer, foreign viruses, bacteria, which are antigens. So lymphocytes help our immune system remember every antigen it comes into contact with. So yeah, they're kind of like memory cells basically. But long term stress can suppress this. That's not good. We don't want that. And a lot of evidence does demonstrate that chronic long term stress, not acute stress, people were more likely to develop respiratory virus, have longer flus and colds, recovery being extremely low and slow. So, you'd get over the symptoms of a cold and flu, but then you'd have repercussions weeks, months later on. So, there is a huge link between stress and a weakened immune system, especially immune resistance to pathogens. And that whole chronic stress is what we worry about. So I do see this in clinic where, especially going back to the whole nocebo effect, clients that are recovering from orthorexia, so that's the labeling food as needing to be clean and good and having that phobia if food is maybe not good for them, and that when they start to actually introduce more diversity in their diet and and take a step back and understand more about their why do they want to get better, what does that mean for them in society, what does that mean for them at home alone, etc., I've noticed a lot of shifts.
Orthorexia is the obsession. Almost, it's treated like a eating disorder. That's why it sounds like anorexia. It sounds like other eating disorders. It is the obsession of eating healthy and being healthy, but to a point that it's a disorder. So just to like add to you, because I do work with people who have that kind of disordered relationship with food and wellness and health. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that term was coined not long ago, actually, maybe around like 10 years ago. But yeah, thank you for explaining that. And just, wrapping everything out, wrapping the stress management techniques and research. There is a meta-analysis, which is the gold standard of research. So a meta-analysis, you get a lot of studies, you combine them together. So all the studies that have the same outcomes, and you combine them together to produce your evidence. So there was a meta-analysis in 2016 that found that mindfulness based interventions did significantly reduce inflammatory markers. So, those are the C reactive protein that we were mentioning earlier, the non-specific protein, pro inflammatory cytokines that are usually elevated in chronic illness, in infection. COVID-19 was one of them, where, yeah, if people are familiar with the cytokine storm, so that's interleukin 6 and other interferons that are increased when there is a pathogen, a virus, an autoimmune reaction. So the fact that that study, that meta-analyses that pooled other studies, demonstrated that psychological interventions did improve immune responses in stress is huge, because we know that stressful or negative thoughts can activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, leading to the release of cortisol. Yes, cortisol release as its play. Chronic activation is not what we want. Acute stress, the anti-inflammatory has its play. It can save us. Chronic overproduction can desensitize glucocorticoid receptors, reducing the cortisol regulatory effect. So this can paradoxically increase inflammatory activity, going back to the sympathetic nervous response that we also mentioned, you were speaking about earlier. Norepinephrine stimulates immune cells, so that whole chronic stress can produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. So when your system is dominant in the sympathetic nervous response, you are constantly high heartbeat, dilated pupils, rapid breathing, intrusive thoughts, the rumination that you were mentioning earlier, Alia. So this can create a pro-inflammatory state. I think it's merely impossible for the human body to heal. Maybe it would return to the baseline that that person is used to, but that doesn't mean that they are healing. So they will still have their chronic condition that they were initially suffering with. And obviously, it's a multifactorial solution when it comes to healing with any chronic illness or any ailment that someone wants to treat, whether it's a hives, whether it's eczema, and all these things that I see in clinic. But one thing we work on, and the missing ingredient that we started the podcast with, is that sense of internal dialogue, the community. And this is something I really stress on in practice, and it's really been eye-opening for me. I've learned so much. And one last interesting thing is that negative thoughts does disrupt the microbiome. The microbiome regulates systemic inflammation. So there is a term coined as stress-induced dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is the imbalance of bacteria, pathogens, yeasts in the microbiome. We all have pathogens in the microbiome. We need some of those pathogens. They're helpful to us. Some pathogens we don't need. Parasites, some of them we need. Some parasites we don't need. Some parasites we've learned to live with. So that it's all about the balance. How much of a good thing do you have? How much of a bad thing do you have? Sometimes too much of a good thing is actually very bad. So that whole topic on, oh, take a probiotic for bloating. Do not take a probiotic for bloating if you have not done a microbiome test. Disclaimer. So stress-induced dysbiosis can lead to something known as intestinal permeability. And that's when your conjunctions in the gut are leaky. So the tight conjunctions that are meant to be like this become like that. What happens when they're like this? They're in your internal body. They start to release inflammatory molecules that enter their circulation.
So, for people who can't see Nawar, what she's talking about is leaky gut, which is the tiny junctions of the intestinal lining, which consist of tiny little cell junctions, and they're meant to be really tight. You want to have good gut lining integrity so nothing can leak from the gut into the system, into the bloodstream, things like food particles or bacteria. But when we are exposed to toxins or inflammatory foods or even negative thoughts, it can create this leakiness in the tight junctions of the gut. It creates little tiny holes.
Yeah, for everybody that just heard that amazing explanation by Alia, thank you. I was just using my hands a bit too much with creating little signals. But yeah, that was really well elaborated. And going back to the whole black and white thinking, negative thoughts will not immediately influence those reactions in the body, where we are discussing chronic activation of these negative thoughts. And going back to that, negative thoughts, when they become your norm, your body starts to adapt to that as your norm. So it's not the negative thought that occurs when you're upset, when you're moody, when this happens. It's the resilience towards it. It's your foundation. It's the person you've become as a result of that. So I think it's important to kind of reiterate that it's easy for people, and myself included, when I was a patient, that we hold on to the smallest things, oh, so if I'm going to have one negative thought, it's, going to ruin my whole system. That's not how it works. It's the chronic thing, because that will tap into the whole, oh, if I have that piece of bread, will I start bloating?
Mhm.
You're feeding into that cognitive bias and it becomes a loop.
I guess this is a really nice segue into leaving our listeners with some interventions on how to support their healing process, whether it's through supporting their mind or their heart, so their emotions, so that we can offer them a few tips on what they can do if they're in these situations of chronic stress or chronic rumination or not feeling good. You were talking about how mindfulness interventions are super powerful. And I guess, mindfulness is really the practice of being in the present. There's a time and a place to think about the future and to plan for the future. And there's a time and a place to reminisce on beautiful memories in the past. But when we're always in the future, always in the past, we're just activating anxiety and worry. So, this kind of practice of mindfulness, of being in the now or focusing on one thing, like a piece of music or a mantra or your breath work also being a really powerful tool to managing the mind and the nervous system. This is just an example of how powerful the mind is and an example of an intervention. Whatever is useful to you, the listeners, or to anybody, for me and you too, Nawar, I'm sure you know this is part of like it's our practice too, that can help calm the mind and bring the mind into the present moment. Sometimes, like for me personally, it's sports or being in nature. Like when I'm kite surfing, I'm nowhere else. Dancing is one of those things that is also always keeping you in the present moment because it's hard to move to the beat if you're not on beat, if you're not like really thinking about the present moment of the music. And that's why we all love dancing. And it can also be playful. And we talked about being playful as well. When it comes to community, I actually just watched the Simone Biles Netflix documentary. For those of you who don't know, she is a GOAT athlete, which is greatest of all times, gymnast. And there was, I think it was during COVID, where her family weren't around her when she was performing. And her mother always, there's a tradition where her mother always braids her hair. And that touch and being with her mom before she gets into the public and starts to do her routine is so important to her. And when that was taken away from her, she didn't actually perform as well. So it's just these like little kind of examples also of like not just managing your mind and your heart and your emotions, but also making sure that you're investing in your loved ones and investing in time spent with them and being present there. Sometimes we're with our loved ones and we're creating these beautiful memories, but we don't realize they're beautiful memories until 10 years from now because we were on our phones or we weren't present or we were agitated about something that happened yesterday. So it's also that kind of like mindfulness presence that we also need to cultivate, not just internally within ourselves, but within our present environment when we're engaging in with other people in social environments. What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so those are amazing things that you mentioned. I incorporate them in practice for myself, apart from the kite surfing. I'm just afraid of the water. But I think that another thing I would add is self compassionate exercises and meditations are something that I found to be super, super helpful and healing. And there's an incredible scientist, she's the pioneer researcher in the field of self compassion. Her name is Dr. Kristen Neff, and she's published multiple papers and studies on how self-compassionate techniques and having those tools can actually influence inflammatory markers in the human body. And she also explains what self-compassion is versus what self-compassion is not. So a lot of people do think that self-compassion is getting away with something really bad, or I don't like to term things as good or bad, but something negative or challenging, and, getting away with things just in general. But it's the self kindness versus self judgment. It's the common humanity versus isolation. So recognizing that suffering is a very common human experience, and these personal inadequacies that we do feel in relationships, at work, in the world are very common, and they're part of our experience. And it's this mindfulness over that self identification, so maintaining that balance between I am this person, I am bad, I am this, I did something wrong, that whole overly identifying with something. So kind of managing that or maintaining that balance of one's emotions without becoming overwhelmed. And she's developed amazing tools. So Dr. Kristen Neff has created specific meditations for in times of overwhelm, dealing with difficult emotions in the body, meditations on self compassionate inquiry, meditations for people who are caregivers, where they require self compassion in these moments to not overly identify, not to overly pick up on that energy. So, yeah, she has honestly around like I think 10 to 15 meditations. I don't even remember them anymore because there's just so many. And I've been following her work since 2019. She's also developed something known as the self compassionate scale. So it's a tool used to measure your own critical voice, and it's really good to use in practice as well. She has a program for practitioners and for patients, and her work is really incredible. So I would definitely add to that list on the whole self compassion inquiry and using that with yourself, other than your family, your friends, your community. You're working on your compassionate voice is, why did this happen to me? And that's part of my experience. I'm going to work with that. So having that, that discrepancy can really change the way things start to heal in your body. So definitely I would add the self-compassion. Another thing I think is important is also working in solitude. So solitude meaning the opposite of isolation, feeling comfortable being alone, walking in nature, having reflective walks, journaling, 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes if you can, if you have the luxury to do so in the morning, just sitting, feeling your body, tapping into your body, doing body scans. Also, Dr. Kristen Neff has body scans that you could do, but taking social media breaks, refreshing who is in your community, the added value certain people have in your community. A lot of us tend to pick up on people's energies and thoughts and take them as our own, whereas there's a line between what you feel and then maybe randomly feeling anxious after an outing, or insecure after an outing, or rejected after an outing, but maybe picking up on someone else's energy. So discerning from what is yours and what is someone else's is also an exercise that I do with them, with clients that I've been practicing. Myself as a super sensitive person, I used to take things very personally as a child growing up. I was a sponge, honestly. I would come back home feeling super overwhelmed, thinking that most of the things I picked up during my day, because I was, in quotes, bad or overly emotional, overly sensitive, etc. So time and solitude can really support in identifying what's yours and what's not yours in the long run. And honestly, other than what you mentioned with the dancing, and I think that's so beautiful and very empowering, is join a group. There are so many amazing groups. They can be virtually, they could be, face to face. These types of groups can be book groups, community groups, cycling groups, running groups, walking groups. Joining a community that really aligns with your values, and it doesn't have to be things with your friends. It's something that, do you like gardening? There are so many amazing initiatives out there where you can volunteer to garden in certain parks, for example, once a month. So creating your own tribe that aligns with who you are at your core is something that's so empowering and healing because it taps into relatability. And that relatability is really, really just on another missing ingredient that we all need. I find, like, for example, for myself, I love reading stories that are similar to some of the things or the challenges that I've personally experienced. So having that relatability in, through blogs or books or some podcasts, but I'm more of a visual person. So relatability is really important. So volunteering, giving back, finding a group, doing something that you enjoy. You don't even have to tell anyone about it. Just do it. Creating that tribe of yours, really.
I really love that piece about relatability because I know how healing it is to know that you're not alone in whatever struggle you're dealing with. And also to add to self-compassion techniques, I've talked about this book. I've probably linked it in many podcast episodes. If you've been following me on Instagram, you know I've been talking about this. It's the No Bad Parts book. I'll link it again in this one. It's just learning about the different parts of your psyche and understanding that there's no bad part of you. And the more that you learn about yourself, the more compassion you have. And you talked about like not being judgmental, and it's that curiosity. You can't be curious and judgmental at the same time. So when you get curious about yourself, about your behaviors, about your quote unquote wrongdoings or your mistakes, you are a little bit more compassionate about yourself, and you learn about yourself, and you learn about why certain things are the way they are for you. Maybe you understand where they stem from. Maybe there's a root cause pain. And when you're compassionate, it's a little bit easier to first you calm that response, but it's easier to heal. And it's also about managing that like internal voice. When we're more compassionate, it's just less inner critic, angry, negative inner voice inside us. And also, like Dr. Daniel Amen always says, like, don't believe every stupid thing you think. We've got like 90,000 thoughts going, like, don't believe every stupid one. Like, not every single thought that needs to be taken like super seriously. And I love the piece about, quietude and solitude and being the opposite of loneliness, but just having that time to just reflect and learn about yourself, maybe read, whether it's stories that are relatable or learning more about psychology. Like, what are the different cognitive biases? What is going on inside me? Like, what are these patterns and why is behavior the way it is? I know that really helpful for me, but I couldn't do that unless I created space for it to be self reflective, to quiet the noise outside of us, whether it's just literally being in a quiet space or turning off my phone or taking social media breaks. Like, we can't heal and grow without those moments. And of course, if anyone needs extra help, find that professional, find that therapist, that coach that can help you learn more about yourself, learn how to manage that internal dialogue, and maybe help you find those blind spots that we all have about ourselves. Nawar, this was such a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. Where can people find you before we close?
Thank you, Alia. I learned a lot from you. This was really, really lovely. I'm not on Instagram, but I can link my website for people to find me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here and see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.